That's great. Thank you, Laura. Right. So as Laura said, my full-time job is working with the Taylor's Checkerspot butterflies. I just work with the one species right now. My background is in biology and as a naturalist, um, and I got into butterflies and moths sort of by accident. I started raising caterpillars as a hobby, and that kind of grew. And Now I'm pretty immersed in the butterfly world for now. So, yeah, I'm going to share some of the magic of these animals with you and some of the amazing work that's being done. I just want to mention before I get started that I'm just one part of the team. There are people working on restoration, there are people working on policy, there are a lot of community members in the places where the checker spots live that do so much work and volunteer work and if I forget to mention it at any point, there's so many people working on it. So here's an adult checker spot. And I'd like to also mention there are multiple species of checker spots. The Taylor's checker spot are a subspecies, and we'll get into their specific biology. But they are the subspecies that lives closest to Vancouver. Their native range, as we'll find out, used to be on Vancouver Island from Victoria all the way up to the Comox area on the Gulf Islands, a few of them, and they also exist in Washington and Oregon. So there are other checker spots you could see in the Okanagan or in alpine areas, for example, but they'd be a different subspecies. So just to set the scene, we're talking about invertebrates today. Within that, insects. And within that, we're talking about something in the order of Lepidoptera. So Lepidoptera is the Latin name for all moths and butterflies. And if you break that down, it actually means scaly wings. So lepido is the base for scaly, and ptera is wings. So if you may have seen this before, but if you look really closely through a microscope at the wings of a moth or butterfly, the dust that would come off on your finger if you touch them is actually microscopic scales, and they come in all different shapes, sizes, colors. So this is a photo I took of a Taylor's checker spot through our microscope at work, and you can see there are some long, hairy type scales, and then all of the small ones. And if you zoom in even more, they actually have ridged edges, and it's really fascinating to see up close. And there are different scales as well. Sometimes there are pheromone scales as well. Anyway, that's the viewpoint we're looking at today. So first of all, this species, they are endangered. There's actually currently only 2 populations left in Canada, and they're located, one is on Denman Island, one of the Gulf Islands you're probably familiar with, and the other is actually near Oyster River. And until maybe 3 years ago, we actually thought there were only butterflies left on Denman Island. The Oyster River population was unknown to us, and so it's just recently been found. So very, very much endangered in BC, and they're actually in a lot of trouble in Washington and Oregon as well. So a lot of the things I'm talking about doing here, there is actually a partner program in the United States at the Oregon Zoo, and they breed this animal as well, the same species. But because they're further south, the genetics, of course, are different, and their populations, probably their traits are a little bit different. So because they're further south, they probably their life cycle is a little bit earlier in the year. So it's really important to conserve what we have here in BC, to conserve the genetic diversity and the traits that have allowed them to survive here historically. So the reason they're endangered is probably because they're a grassland species, so that makes it complicated. There's a lot of different factors. A lot of it has to do with habitat being converted for development. As we all know, the southern half of Vancouver Island is the more heavily developed area, and they are using the grasslands, so they're not found in anywhere where there's mountains. And actually, where they live right now, some of it is coastal bluff, and it is associated also with the Gary Oak suite of ecosystems, which you're probably also familiar with as being very much reduced in size. I don't have statistics for BC, but in Washington, there used to be 100,000 hectares of suitable habitat for the Taylor's checker spot, and now they're down to under 100 hectares of suitable habitat. So from 100,000 to under 100. And the populations are hugely reduced there as well. So similar sort of situation. And they're also vulnerable to fire suppression. So because they're grassland species, like a lot of grassland species, they actually thrive when parts of the landscape are burned. And for a lot of years, humans have been suppressing fire in their habitats because human settlements and fire don't go together very well. So that's something that's also being worked on, is that controlled burns might be a tool we get to use in the future to manage their habitat. Yeah, they're also, the northern populations here in BC are also more important than ever as we look towards the future and the climate is changing. So we don't know how the southern populations will fare. Will there be a shift northward in habitat suitability? But in any case, we're trying to preserve what's left, and we're actually working to start new populations. So here's some of the work that is being done. This is Hellawell Provincial Park on Hornby. And Hellawell is really important. This is actually where the caterpillars that I raise get released. So for the last 2 years, we've released thousands of caterpillars, well, many hundreds of caterpillars, maybe over 2,000, into Hellawell on Hornby Island. This is a historical habitat for the species, and it is suitable for them. It has everything they need, and so we're hoping to establish a third British Columbia population within Hellawell. So I was there. I got to go with and bring my caterpillars in person and release them on Hornby Island in March of this year. So that was really exciting work. And there were lots of other people involved, like BC Parks and the ministry and so on, and Gary Oak's ecosystems restoration team. So at WPC, our solution to all of the problems I just brought up, our part of the puzzle is that we're going to make more butterflies, and that's what I'm actively doing. And it's not just because more butterflies is better, it's also, as I mentioned, about preserving the genetic variation that we have in BC for the species. And also, so we're working to establish that population on Hornby, and then we'll have 3 in BC, and that'll give us a better buffer against losing the species, hopefully. And we'll get into insect biology a little bit, I think, later on. So here's how their life cycle starts. I'm sure you all know butterfly life cycle, but I'm just going to show you the specifics of this species. This is really the interesting stuff to me. So this should be a video that's playing for you. Here's one of my captive females, and she's laying her eggs. This is the most exciting thing to see. Last year, I had about 8 productive females, which isn't very high, but they did manage to lay over 1,300 viable eggs. So I did raise 1,350 caterpillars of the species from 8 females. Yeah, so they lay their eggs on plantain, which you might be familiar with. It is a plant that is really common. It's actually not a native plant to the area, but it's a plant that has been around for long enough that many species of checkerspots have sort of converted over to plantain as their food source for caterpillars. So the Taylor checkerspot will still use veronicas as an egg-laying plant and to feed their caterpillars, but they'll also use plantain. So in Hellawell, where we release them, they use plantain as their food plant. So in captivity, we use plantain as well. to keep it consistent. And I wouldn't mind taking questions throughout. If you wanted to ask a question, you don't have to wait until the end. I'm not sure how you usually structure things, but I don't mind. Okay, so she lays her eggs. She'll lay sort of 100-ish at a time, and she'll lay on one day, take a break, and lay the next day, and always on the underside of the leaf. And they always only lay on the correct food for their caterpillars to eat. And that's a trait shared by lots of butterflies and moths. So that the caterpillars can hatch and essentially get right down to business and start eating right away. It's really interesting how the females figure out what leaf to lay their eggs on. They actually have chemoreceptors, kind of like taste buds, in their feet or their tarsal claws on their legs. So they're actually tasting with their feet to know where is the best spot to put their eggs. So sometimes if you see a female butterfly sort of flit to a plant and land, and flit away and land on another plant, she might actually be examining them with her feet to see which one is appropriate to lay her eggs on. And here they are. They're really small, and they're actually beautifully dome-shaped and ridged, a lot like a monarch egg that you might be more familiar with. But these ones are in clumps. So they're laid in clumps, and then over time, if they're viable, over a few days they turn brown, and then eventually they'll turn red, and then right before they hatch, they actually become clear. So these, the clear ones here are viable, and they're going to hatch. It's imminent. And I have a video of when they do hatch, how incredibly tiny these caterpillars are. And you can see the little black specks on the leaf there are actually their poo. That's their frass. That's just what insect poo is called. And so they come out, and you can see they're actually eating the leaf, but they're so small, they're actually only eating a layer of cells off of the leaf. They're not actually eating through the leaf. So you'll be able to see that there are sort of some holes near the eggs. And they basically get right down to business. They're laid in a group, and they actually hang out in a group as they grow as caterpillars. So they are sort of a communal group of siblings for a long time, and they'll make a web. Once everyone's hatched, they'll sort of make a web around the part of the leaf that they're feeding on, and they'll sort of move along, make new webs as they go. So they are web making caterpillars. Not as much as, oh, go ahead.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Of the number of eggs that are laid, about what percentage is viable?
Oh, that's a good question. So this year it was about half, but it's not really indicative of. So the females can lay eggs without breeding. So some of those eggs were never going to be viable at all. It's called egg dumping. So a female butterfly, at some point, she's going to lay her eggs whether or not she's been bred, and obviously, if she hasn't been bred, the eggs won't hatch.
Okay.
So yeah. So when we breed them, we look for long breeding time. And actually, just last year, I noticed that, and this is common among butterflies, I think, but they actually have a sperm plug. So the male, when they have intercourse, there's a large sort of a capsule that goes with the sperm into the female, and it often contains protein, and it takes time for her to break it down and to use that protein. So you can actually see whether or not sperm has been transferred to the female after they've bred. And Dennis has his hand, or sorry, Denis.
Yes, you mentioned web. Is that the same thing that tent caterpillars do?
Yeah, it is very much the same. It looks a little bit less dense when these guys do it, but it's made out of silk and very similar texture. Yeah. So I have some more videos. Oh, here they are. So they go through. Oh, another hand is up. Go ahead if you'd like.
Hi, yeah, I just had a question. You talked about releasing about 1,000 caterpillars each year. Do you know how many successfully transition to adults approximately each year, the ones that you release? And when you, I guess, when you breed them, are those the same adults that you bring back?
Good question. So last March was so March 2020 was the first time we released these caterpillars onto Hornby Island. And then in the flight season, when they were adults in May, there were people who were on Hornby and saw adults flying. We saw about, I believe, 73 adults, and we had released 800 caterpillars. And so that's how many adults we saw. However, it's really hard to tell if they bred successfully and laid eggs, and if the caterpillars survived all the way through to the next year. So we were back there in early March of 2021 this year looking for caterpillars, and we actually weren't able to find any. So we were looking, and I can imagine that they could have been there and we couldn't see them, but we haven't been able to confirm if they overwintered successfully there yet or not. And we did all of that looking before we released the next set of caterpillars. So now we've released another 1,200 caterpillars, and someone will be there this May to see if the adults are flying. And so the other life stages are still a bit mysterious. So we're still doing field work to figure out how it's going when we don't have them in hand. So I hope that answers your question. Oh, and the adults that I'm breeding are sourced from Oyster River. So the Oyster River population right now is the biggest. And so I have about 60 caterpillars that are going to become breeding butterflies in my program that we kept back from last year. And I have about 60 that came from Oyster River. And that will keep the genetics really fresh. And also having so many adults will give me lots of opportunity to hopefully produce a ton of caterpillars. So we'll see.
Thank you. That was very informative. Thank you.
No problem. Okay. So I was saying as they grow, they shed their skin like all caterpillars. And every time they grow and shed their skin, that's called passing into another instar. So they go through 6 of these instars as caterpillars, and every time they shed their skin, it's really interesting. They look a little bit different. So you'll come in the next day and you'll find shed skins inside their container, and you'll also see that suddenly the caterpillars have a slightly different characteristic. They're fuzzier, or they have bright orange spots now, etc. So this is what they look like in the final instar. They're really fuzzy. They have these bright orange spots, and they actually still hang out in groups. So we raise them inside of like big Tupperware bins or shoebox size Tupperware, and we'll raise maybe 10 or 15 in a box, but they'll all group together still. They'll come up on top. We put in paper towel as like a fake leaf litter because they're ground dwelling species, so they'd be using the features of the ground. And they do a lot of basking. So they come up on and sit on top together to get nice and warm, and that helps them obviously with all of their body processes. But it is interesting to see them together, and I think in caterpillars that hang out in groups like that, it offers a form of protection against predators. I think they're hedging their bets that a predator would come, try one of these. I'm imagining a bird or something. Try one caterpillar, and this species, like many caterpillars, is actually slightly toxic to birds. So if a bird were to eat them, they would throw up. And also the fuzz is meant to be a deterrent as well, as far as we know. So hopefully a bird would try one and the rest of the group would escape from the encounter unscathed, because it wouldn't go very well for the bird. So I think that that's part of the way that they keep themselves safe. So these guys are pretty speedy. The warmer they are, the faster they move. So it's really easy to clean them and feed them in the morning because they're not very warm yet. But by the afternoon, they're like little race cars zooming around. So it's interesting. And this is kind of the life stage they're finishing up right now in real time. So like today, I was taking care of caterpillars this size and trying to get them nice and warm and hurry them along to their chrysalis stage. So here, oh, here's the webbing. Here's a picture of it. So they make little webs like this. They sort of glue the paper towel together. And in nature, I'm assuming that would be more like some dried leaves or some grasses that they glue together. And they make sort of a little pocket for themselves. And this is actually a picture of them in midsummer. So I'm kind of backtracking a little. So this at the end of summer, around late July, so that's midsummer, they actually go into diapause. So they make these little packets for themselves and they actually curl up and go to sleep until March. So they spend so many months inactive. And they can actually, so over the winter, that's how they pass the winter, is as caterpillars. And they can actually freeze solid during diapause. They can get wet, get frozen, and they still wake up okay. Obviously, we try to keep them safe, but as you can imagine, if they were in their natural habitat, they'd be being rained on, temperatures dropping overnight, etc. And they wake up, and as soon as it gets warm, they wake up and start eating again, and they're perfectly fine. So they're one of those species that can make natural antifreeze inside their body. So they actually concentrate glucose inside their cells. They move a lot of the water outside of their cells, and that prevents ice crystals from forming inside of their cells because that would burst the cells of their body. So other animals do that, like wood frogs. I don't know any really great BC examples. Oh, I did see someone had a picture of a mourning cloak, and so they pass the winter as adult butterflies, and so of course they can freeze solid as an adult, so they have a similar adaptation, I'm sure. Oh, is your hand up? Sorry.
Oh, yeah. I just want to say, so if they overwinter as caterpillars, that means that the ones that you released on Hornby in spring 2020 none of those would have been the adults you saw anyways, because they would have had to spend a winter as caterpillars?
Good question. So they are caterpillars from June through April. And so the ones we released in March were really close to, they would be making their chrysalis.
Oh, they were in their second year already.
That's right. Yeah.
They had the winter. Okay,
That's
thank
right.
you.
Yeah, no problem. So the ones we did know that we were able to be sure that the butterflies we saw in 2020 on Hornby were from our caterpillars, because before we released our caterpillars there were no checker spots on the island at all. So they had been completely extirpated. So it's it's kind of a groundbreaking project because we're reintroducing the insect completely to the area. So it does give us an opportunity to say, okay, we started at 0, and then where do we get from there? So that part is really interesting. So they overwinter in diapause, and then this is what they're supposed to be doing this week, is curling up and doing what we call J-hang, and that is the precursor to this process. So this caterpillar just shed its skin for the final time, and inside actually it's a chrysalis, it's a pupa, and also called a chrysalis this time. So they're actually, some of mine have already undergone this process this year, and I'm trying to hurry the rest along so that everyone catches up and does it at the same time. So they'll make their chrysalis, and this process only takes maybe 30 minutes at the most. But this chrysalis over the next day will sort of dry and harden. Right now it's really soft and vulnerable, and over the next day it dries and hardens into something really beautiful. So this is the chrysalis after maybe 1 or 2 days. And it turns this beautiful icy blue color. Again, it has orange spots. And I have a different view of it to show you. So here's the side view. And you can see the larger black holes where the purple arrows are pointing. Those are the spiracles. So those are like the breathing holes that insects have. At all life stages, they have spiracles to breathe through. Yeah, someone has their hand up.
What I was wondering, you said you were trying to hurry them along so they would all be at the same stage. Would there be a benefit if it was in nature that they not be at all the same time? Because if the conditions happen to be really bad 1 week, another set were a week later, they might survive the terrible conditions of the week before. Would that ever come into play?
Yeah, I think so. I think for sure in a natural habitat, I think there would be variation. I think that's a really good thought. So, for example, on Hornby, there is slopes, there are southern facing slopes and there's more northern facing slopes. And I think you would even get variation on those two slopes of when they come out. And there's also other microhabitat elements, like are they closer to the edge of the forest and they're getting more shade, or are they in a very sun exposed spot? And yeah, all of that variation does help them to hedge their bets for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
The ones I'm hurrying up, so I said before I have 60 from captivity and 60 from the wild. The ones that I got in from the wild, I only got them in maybe 2 weeks ago. And they came in at a later life stage than my captive ones. So they must have been exposed to more heat earlier on in the year than mine have been in captivity. So I have all my wild ones, I'm trying to keep them nice and cool and slow them down, and it's working quite well. And then all my captive ones, I'm trying to keep them nice and warm and hurry them up so that they can meet in the middle, and that's just for breeding. But yeah, totally, that variation is really the key for insects, is variety, because certainly little patches will go extinct, and that's all about insect population dynamics, but little bits will go extinct, but some over here are doing okay and they'll recolonize, and that's the, yeah, totally good thinking. Anyways, on this, on this pupa, you can also see the outline of the wings, and then I have a front view of the face. So if you look at the long dark lines with the little white dashes across, those are actually on both sides. Those are the antenna, and you can also see sort of the outline of the eyes and the mouth parts, and inside the antenna there's some sort of vertical structures, and those are actually the arms folded up as well. So it is really beautiful to see all of the body parts on this chrysalis. But when they first form a chrysalis, the inside is actually just a liquid. The whole caterpillar sort of dissolves into a liquid inside of this new chrysalis skin and sort of rearranges all the body parts, and everything dissolves and then reforms. It's really, there's some really cool MRI images of the process online, but we really haven't totally even figured it out. Oh, and this is a really cool adaptation. So I showed you sort of the silk that they make their little webs with. And then they also use this silk to make a little silk button. So they spin a little mess of silk in one spot. In captivity, they do this on paper towel, but they make a little mess of silk, and it's really small little dot. And then when they form their chrysalis, this structure called a cremaster, which is basically a stick, comes out of the hind end and entangles into this silk, and that's how a butterfly chrysalis hangs. And so all the species do this, as far as I know. So it's not glued on, but it is attached, and it's actually a structure a lot like Velcro. So the end of the cremaster has all these little hooks and barbs, and that gets tangled in the silk, and that's what they're hanging from. Yeah, there's another hand up.
Yes, so the chrysalis is when you were naming all basically the wings and the various parts of the to-be butterfly, or sorry, yeah, butterfly, is there an extra layer, like a cuticle that makes up the actual chrysalis over top of that? Like, so it's a fairly not necessarily rigid, but protective layer?
That's a good way of describing it. Yeah, so yes, so what we saw when that one sort of wriggled out of its caterpillar skin, that sort of cuticle that you're talking about was already formed inside. And that's how every time they shed their skin as a caterpillar as well, there's a whole nother new cuticle inside already. And there's actually a new head capsule inside, and the old head capsule, when they're caterpillars and they shed, is already empty by that point. And they just push out. And it's a similar thing when they become the chrysalis, there's a new cuticle inside already. And then they shed that caterpillar skin one last time. And then, but inside of that cuticle, everything is liquid at that point. It's really strange. I've actually seen one at this stage when they become a chrysalis. I've actually seen one burst, and it just is liquid that leaks out. It was unfortunate, but it was really interesting that there's no discernible like body inside of there at that point. So
well, yeah, very interesting, because it's very similar, or I'm making a comparison here with crabs. That cuticle forms prior to their new exoskeleton forming. So very similar process.
cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, it's super alien too. Every time I see them do it, it reminds me of a science fiction movie. It's like, this is where they get their ideas for those
Yes,
monsters and things.
yes, thanks.
No problem. So yeah, so we have the cremaster, which is, and Nigel and Sue, your hand is up, but did you already have your question answered? Or did you have another one?
No, we did have it answered. We don't know how to turn it off.
No problem. And if you have another one, you can just say so.
There we go. Thank
Okay,
you.
no problem. Awesome. So yeah, the cremaster is an awesome adaptation. So strange, and also as it's shedding that last caterpillar skin, this cremaster sort of just emerges out of nowhere, it seems like, and all of that wiggling gets it really nice and tangled in the silk. So everything kind of works really well together. Yeah, in a really unexpected way. And sometimes I find they're chrysalis and they're not attached to the silk at all. But if I can find the little silk button that they made, I can just touch the cremaster to the silk and it'll attach itself immediately. And that's the best way to have them, because they need that hanging position to emerge properly. So, and then I have a video. I just missed the very moment that this, I think it's a female, burst out of her chrysalis, but it's really interesting to watch. So when they emerge, they spend some time pumping their wings full of liquid. So they sort of pump their abdomen to push the body fluid through the veins. And this takes about maybe 2 hours, but we leave them for a full day before we handle them at all, because the wings are still really soft and delicate at this point. Oh no, that's a boy, it turns out. You can tell by the tip of the abdomen. But it's also very interesting, they also, during this stage, their proboscis, which is their straw-like mouth part, their proboscis actually comes out as two sort of semicircles, and they actually spend a lot of time extending it, and eventually the two halves sort of zip together to form the tube that is their mouth part. So it doesn't come out as one, it comes out as two, and they kind of use fluid pressure to sort of zip it up. And so when they come out, you'll see that they're doing a lot of extending and retracting of that part. And it's because they're trying to get it attached to, the two sides attached to each other. Yeah, and otherwise they wouldn't be able to feed if that doesn't go well.
Wow. Sorry, can I ask a question there? What would be the, what would be the value of that? Like, why go through that extra step, so to speak?
I think so. My theory is that it has to do with bilateral symmetry. So everything, there's one on each side of all the corresponding parts. But yeah, I don't. That's just how they're doing it.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, it is. And until that was sort of recently realized that they have to use fluid pressure to zip the two together. That was like someone did a bunch of research to figure that out, how they're doing it. Yeah. Thanks. No problem. So they come out as an adult, and this is one of my beautiful males. Once they're adults, we let them rest for a day, and then we feed them. So he's on a Q-tip that's been soaked in a diluted honey water. And those blue dots on his wing are not natural. I added those with Sharpie. So we actually mark our adults, and that gives us their unique individual ID. And that helps us to know later on if they're a successful breeder, how much did they weigh, where did they come from, who were their parents. And we need to mark them because at times they're kept in groups, depending on the breeding scenario. So I'll show you sort of this is a group of males. So these are all male siblings, and they're all being fed on honey Q-tips. And on a nice day, it's go time. So these are the sorts of mesh cages that I use. Each of those cages right now will have at least one male and a female inside of it. And the males emerge from their chrysalis a few days before the females on average. And they also, in their natural habitat, would spend some time sort of establishing a territory and interacting with each other before the females emerge. Yeah, go ahead with your question. Ray and Paul?
Sorry about that. Could you tell us what was on the Q-tip? It looked like a sticky, maybe sugary solution on the last slide.
Yeah, so we use honey water to feed them. So it's just honey mixed with water. I think it's about 1/3 honey to 2/3 water, but I haven't done it in a year, so I'll have to double check before they emerge. And we also offer them flowers, but it's harder to get them to use flowers voluntarily in captivity because they can't forage like they normally would. So often with my adults, I actually kind of roll them up onto a Q-tip gently, and as soon as their proboscis touches it, they start to drink. And that's the easiest way. I found that with offering them flowers, I worry that they're not getting enough nectar. So every day, twice a day, when it's hot out, I feed them manually. We also offer them, last year we tried salt water, and this year we're going to try elk tea, which is a very appetizing mix of elk poo and water. And that's actually going to be to allow them to puddle. So they also, in the wild, most butterfly species also puddle. So you have probably seen this. Mourning cloaks actually do this quite a bit. Swallowtails, you could see often on the ground around puddles. And along the edges where the puddle has receded, there will be extra minerals. And they'll also use animal dung of various kinds to get protein and salts that they need. And this especially helps the males. So earlier when I was talking about sperm capsules that they give to the females during mating, those require a lot of protein. So often male butterflies will do this behavior, and it's called puddling, where they get nutrients from dung or puddles. And yeah, so if you see butterflies at a puddle, often it's males. So we're going to offer them elk tea this year. That's how they do it in Oregon. And it was funny, I was talking to the butterfly keeper there, and she was like, yeah, so we offer them puddling on elk tea. And I said, oh, that's great. Could you maybe email me the recipe for elk tea? And she said, no, it's just elk poo and water. So we're going to try that this year. and hopefully they make use of it. Because we're at the zoo, it's really easy for me to get elk poo. The elk actually live right next door to where I do all of this butterfly work. So it's no problem to get a little bit of elk poo, and we'll see how that goes. So we breed them in these mesh cages. And they need sunny conditions. They prefer a light breeze. They prefer if it's a little bit of sun, a little bit of cloud, and the temperature is fluctuating. I don't know what kind of mood music they prefer yet. I'm hoping that this year we have a ton of success breeding. Last year we had about, I want to say, so I said 8 productive females, and I had about 80 animals in my breeding program. So that's only 16 successful copulations. So this year we're going to try many new things and see if we can increase the success. So see what the next picture is. There they are. So the top here is a female and the bottom butterfly is a male. He's lazily hanging. The females are actually bigger and stronger. Well, they're bigger, I should say, but they don't do a lot of flying because their abdomen is so heavy with all of the eggs. The males are much more mobile, much more active. Yeah, so we hope that they'll be attached like this for an hour, and that's when we have the most success. So in this year's breeding season, we're going to try and mimic more natural conditions. So we're going to have males who will emerge earlier, hopefully, in an enclosure. And then we'll have a female who is freshly emerged from her pupa within the enclosure, as well as if she were to emerge in the male's territory. And we're hoping that will increase our success. Yeah, it's really interesting to learn about their biology and nature and try to apply that in a captive setting. Yeah, Sylvia. You can go ahead. Yeah, please ask your question.
Sylvia, you can unmute yourself. Just click on your microphone. There you go.
Yes, I was just curious. It's kind of like they're growing up drinking off of Q-tips and things like that. How do they do when you release them into the wild? Do they know to go to flowers? Like, do they adapt to quite a different, even though it's natural? Do they have trouble?
That's a good question. So, of course, they're in captivity, so we're manipulating their lifestyle, but it won't actually be these specific adults that get released. It will be their offspring. So we're hoping that this breeding will result in a few hundred eggs, and I'll raise those caterpillars up, and then the caterpillars will get released. So the adults actually only live for about a month maximum. And it is, you're doing, that is good thinking. It's a good question, because the caterpillars that I raise from these eggs that they'll hopefully make also will be raised in captive conditions. So I'm offering them the exact leaf that they need to eat. I'm, they're kept in a very sanitary sort of condition, very different from the wild, no threat of predators. So we don't know how that changes their physiology or behaviors, but with insects, a lot of their behavior, it's not learned, it's just a sort more innate. So we don't worry really about it changing their behavior. But if they have shown that if you raise multiple generations of butterflies in captivity, it does change the size of their wings, their body weight as well, because they adapt so quickly as insects. They're so malleable to their environment. They're really good at adapting. So we try not to keep any genes in our program for more than 1 or 2 years. So if any of my captive bred from last year butterflies end up breeding this year, none of those will stay. All of those will go back out into the wild because that will be 2 generations of captivity, and we don't want to exceed that and start to change their biology. But yeah, that's good thinking. I think the next generation will be able to find their food source. They'll still have all the tools in their toolbox, I think.
Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, so they do this Superman, or I guess Spider-Man pose, and shortly thereafter, maybe 2 days later, 3 days, depending on the temperature, the female will start to lay eggs, and the life cycle begins all over again. And hopefully by that point, I'll have many thousands of caterpillars to care for, and it gets really hectic and a little more monotonous after the breeding is over. So yeah, so here is Bonnie Zan. She's one of our biologists, one of the biologists on the team, I should say. And here she is putting the caterpillars out in Hellowell last March. And this is a really fun day. Normally we take lots of volunteers with us, but during COVID times, we kept it to a minimum this year. But yeah, so basically we do it with paintbrushes because that's a really easy way to move the caterpillars, and we put them out in little groups so they're still with their siblings. We try to put them in really good small micro habitats that suit them and have their food plant. Awesome. This is a video of me last year. So my workspace right now is sort of an unheated shed, which actually works because we need ambient temperatures for the insects. And we also have a greenhouse that we use when we need more warmth. And I have some outdoor shelving areas where I keep them as well, and just collecting lots of data. Every pupa gets weighed, and every adult gets weighed, etc., and assigned their individual ID and so on. Did anyone have any questions before I keep going? And I'll try to speed up a little. I know it's been a long time. Okay. So then I'm just going to talk a little bit about what they look like and maybe why they look the way that they do. So they're obviously not a very well camouflaged butterfly. They're quite obvious. They're white and black and orange. But first I want to talk about how the chrysalis looks. So that beautiful icy blue with the little speckles on it. But actually I noticed that it looks a lot like a little bird poop on a leaf. And this is just from my perspective, this is a really close resemblance. And this is actually a strategy used by a lot of moths and butterflies. A really good way to keep a bird from eating you is to look like bird poop. So there's lots of species of butterfly that at some point their caterpillar looks exactly like a bird poo. Many chrysalises do. And there are actually moths that as adults, their common name is bird dropping moth, and they look exactly like a fresh bird dropping or even shiny. So this is a strategy they're using. And I think when they're in a chrysalis form, that's what they're hoping to be passed by birds, is because they just look like a little bird poop on a leaf. From my human perspective anyways. And when they're adults, as I was saying before, they're using that familiar black, white, and orange pattern. So in the other picture here, that's a monarch. And the black, white, and orange on a monarch is a signal saying, don't eat me, especially if you're a bird, I'm going to make you throw up. And because the monarchs sequester toxins from their food, the milkweed, and it's a different toxin, but the Taylor checkerspot actually also sequesters toxins from their food and can make a predator a little bit ill. So they're using a similar set of warning colors, and you'll see that a lot in the insect world with brightly colored beetles and things of that nature. So that's called aposematism, and you might be totally familiar with it, but I believe that's what the Taylor Checkerspots are doing as adults, is using aposematism. Instead of hiding, they're bright and obvious, and it's a warning. So the hope is if a predator eats one Taylor's checker spot, they're not likely to try it again. And as I said earlier, that full-grown caterpillars are using that strategy as well, as far as we can tell. It's hard to ask the birds what they think of all this. But.
Hi, Michelle. There's one question in the chat. If you had one female and two males in your cage, would the males compete to mate with the one female?
Good question. So the female seems to exercise some selection. She seems to choose a male because she'll sort of curve her abdomen to make it easier for him to sort of attach himself. So she might, they do a lot of interacting. They do a lot of like touching their antennas together, touching each other, fluttering around. And I don't know how that would look in the wild. The reason we put multiple males in a cage is because at Oregon Zoo, they've been doing this longer. And they've found that if you don't have multiple males interacting, that they won't breed. So there's something about the competition of other males nearby. But yeah, so one of the males only will get to breed with her. And she'll only breed once in her lifetime. And it seems like she does exercise some choice over who it's going to be. How she tells who it should be, we're not sure. Yeah, you can go ahead with your question.
So does each male only mate once, or can one male mate with multiple females?
The males can breed more than once. So they need about a day's break, they say, to be able to make a new sperm plug. But the males should be able to breed more than once. I haven't had any go more than once. But that's because I've only had so few breed that I didn't give them, if they've bred once, that's all. I didn't give them another chance. We need, because we want the variety of genetics.
And how quickly after they breed do they die?
Oh, so the males and the females, their whole lifespan is about a month. And I think that the lifespan is the same whether or not they breed. So they sort of age at the same rate, whether or not they've bred. And I believe in the wild, their lifespan would probably be a little bit shorter because they would experience a lot more wing wear and they might have to work harder to find food. Whereas I'm really babying them and feeding them every day. And later on, when their wings are more worn, they're getting, manually moved to another cage or a new plant to lay eggs on, etc.
So do they breed like right after they become butterflies, or they all throughout that month-long period they could breed?
I've had the most success on the right away. The sooner I can get them into a cage with the opposite sex, the more successful it is. So sometimes last year it was hard because a lot of them emerged say on Monday, a lot of them came out of their chrysalis, but then it was rainy Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So now they've been a butterfly for 6 days without any opportunity to breed because they really won't do anything until the sun shines directly on them. So I can warm them up in the greenhouse, but that doesn't help. It has to be real direct sunlight. So we really hope for good weather right when they come out. So we'll see. Yeah. So this is an adult on hornbeam. This is really the goal that we're working towards. This is an adult butterfly. And this is what we're hoping to see this year. And we're going to keep doing surveys to see if we can confirm that they're doing the full life cycle on Hornby Island or not. I wish I could say that we found caterpillars this spring. That would have been so great to confirm that they're breeding on the island, but we will look again next March. And because it's a 1-year life cycle, if we see them next March before we release more, then we'll know that some have bred and hatched and survived the winter. And so on. I think, yeah, if there's any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them, or anything I missed addressing.